And what's the translation for global energy markets?
This is still the energy and AI panel. Am I in the right room? Should I be going the other direction? It's Bernard, over to you. Look, I think this is as we talked about yesterday on your show, what has happened over the last, answering that question, you can't do without basically stating the context that we're in. October 7 is going to be remembered, first was remembered as the most horrific attack on Israel and the Jewish state since the Holocaust. That is not how it's going to be remembered. It's going to be remembered as the unraveling of the Middle East that we knew over the last 80 years. And Iran's regime unraveling started, what we're seeing today starts in April, I think it was April 13 last year. They take a fateful decision to overreact to a minor, relatively speaking, minor incident and fire 300 missiles and drones from their own territory for the very first time towards Israel. And with enough advance notice that we were able to prepare for it and repelled it with near 100%. And I say we is because it was the United States as the quarterback with multiple countries plus Israel repelling it. That is the moment. The reason I say that is that Iran had three threats that were its deterrents. One was its missile program. The second was its proxies. And the third was its potential to go nuclear, military application of nuclear. Their proxies are weak and have been weakened considerably, if they even barely exist. That April, followed by then October, took away their missile deterrence because it could be defeated. And so the only thing remaining is the nuclear program. What is astonishing about Iran is that it made miscalculation after miscalculation after miscalculation. They had an opportunity for a deal with us. They had an opportunity for a deal with President Trump over the last several weeks. They overbelieved in their power that was almost non-existent. And Israel has been able to do whatever they wanted. So where we are today, if you carry this through and Fordo is still there at the end, then you ask yourself, what are you doing this for? What is all this about if they still have that program? There's only one question that remains in my mind right now, and that is, does Fordo get dismantled through a MOP or an ordinance, the United States, or does it get dismantled through diplomatic means? That's the only question that I see that remains. And that's the option on the table. Does the president want to do the attack or not? Do the Iranians understand the weakness of their position? The logical position for them to come and say, I'll dismantle it, I understand the position I'm in. They have not made logical decisions for the last many months, so I don't know. The consequence of that is, do they say, if I go down, everybody goes down? There are things they can do in the region that would be short-term impactful, not long-term, but would rile the markets, they would rile public opinion at home and overseas. They can have short-term effects, but that's where we are right now. I'm not going to comment on the assassination of foreign leaders. I think nobody should comment on the assassination of foreign leaders. I'll just leave that to whatever the news cycle is.
So the president's options are take out the nuclear program with the support of the United States combined with Israel, or take a diplomatic track. Now, that would have severe consequences for oil and energy markets, no matter which way the president goes, right? If you were a betting man, which way do you think it goes at this point? The path of escalation or the path of diplomacy?
First, I'm not sure that I agree with the premise of the question, because I'm not sure that I agree that it would have consequences for the energy markets. Either way, I think, look, there's a lot of really smart energy people here in the room. If I gave a hypothetical any time over the last several decades and said, Israel goes to war against Iran, oil price, nobody says up 5%. That's where we are right now. So I think it's because the weakness of Iran's ability to respond is so profound. I mean, they're now lobbing 1 or 2 missiles instead of 50, that I'm not sure that escalation necessarily means. The only way that it has an impact is if it goes the route of escalation, the Iranians refuse to surrender even then and decide to escalate the energy markets, meaning Hormuz or short and medium range missiles into Saudi Arabia, the Green Zone in Iraq, UAE, the Fifth Fleet, wherever, whatever. Those are the things that they can still do that would rile the markets. If it goes diplomacy, then the markets you may even see a massive drop in prices significantly below where they were before this started. So all security risk premiums go away. But if it goes the escalation, even then it would depend on what the reaction of the regime is and if it's still there.
Okay, Bernard, come in on this because you have actually led a super major. You've made investment decisions based on the price of oil. How closely are you following this upheaval and the impact that it's having on markets? And as an extension of that, I think in a worst case scenario, JP Morgan said 130 USD oil could be on the agenda as a result. What do you make of that?
Well, first of all, thank you, Dan, for having us, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for the invitation. And it's lovely to see some friends in the audience, and great to be on with Amos, obviously. First of all, we're dealing with a human tragedy, so we should always start with that, and our hearts go out to the people that are impacted in these countries, and it's real. In terms of the markets, Amos said 5-6%. Let's say the price of oil is up 5 or 10% today, whatever it may be. Put in context, in the 70s, during the embargo, the price of oil tripled. During the Gulf War, the price of oil doubled. We're talking about 5%, 10% movement. So it is important to put all of this in context. Now, the market has been working relatively well. A lot of uncertainties around the world with a lot of issues, clearly, whether it be Venezuela, whether it be shale oil, whether it be terrorist economic growth, what's happening in Libya, the list goes on. But the market's been working reasonably effectively. And what you're seeing is people trying to predict the answer to the question that Amos was just being asked, which is what's going to happen. And the reality is we don't know what's going to happen. At least I don't know what's going to happen and what the various responses are going to be. What I do know is that there are two sides that may be fighting for, in their minds, their survival. And that's quite different to fighting maybe over a piece of land. So we don't know what's going to happen. And the only thing that you can say in that context about what's happening in the oil price world will be, we can expect volatility. That is the only thing, Dan, that I think is predictable right now. And you're seeing that every day on whatever news flow is coming or going, is you're going to expect a lot of volatility. And until we know whether certain terminals get taken out, whether there's a blockade, what's going to happen, as Amos rightly said, are other places hit? We don't know, but you can expect a lot of volatility, and you can expect a lot of people in companies like BP and Exxon and Shell and so on and so forth, worrying about how they're going to keep their customers in stock, how they're going to take care of their people as they navigate ships throughout the region and so on and so forth.
Okay, so let's shift the conversation over to energy and AI. And I want to thank both of you for your contributions there, because I do think this is a really important part of the conversation. Bernard, you've gone from leading a super major. Now your focus is on net positive AI, which is equally as ambitious. So what does net positive AI actually mean? And how are you thinking about this convergence of energy and AI in this macro environment? It's certainly the topic du jour right now.
Well, it's look, things have to be pretty simple for me. So net positive AI is a pretty simple concept, which is simply like anything in life, there are positives and negatives, and there are many negatives that we read a lot about around AI. It could be jobs, it could be deep fakes, it could be in the energy world. It's all about the energy consumption and the incredible power consumption that we have. So there are negatives to things, and at the same time, there are positives. Now, as is often the case, we read more about the negatives than we do about the positives. And I think there are some extraordinary positives around AI. And I would go so far as to say, I actually think we should feel very fortunate to live in the age of AI, because I think the potential, whether it be on the healthcare front, medicine, Alzheimer's, cancer, you name it, is tremendous. And on the energy side, it's also tremendous. We have major issues with our infrastructure, and we keep talking about building new infrastructure and permitting and planning, and how do we do that? But before you do that, you should make sure you're getting the most out of the infrastructure that you have. And AI has got enormous potential. Dynamic load ratings on power lines, being able to predict the weather patterns so that if it's cooler, we can get more current through the line. We can do that, plan for that. AI can help us do things that our minds simply can't do on their own. And optimize, predict demand before it happens such that we can get the supply patterns right. It can help us on permitting. You've all seen the thousands of pages of documents that get put together that take literally months and in some cases years. If AI can help us cut through some of that, and it can. So there's huge upsides. We need to talk more about them. We need to minimize the negatives, such as building more efficient infrastructure. And net positive is simply saying, let's make sure that the benefits of AI vastly outweigh the negatives. And that's what the agenda is about.
Amos, come in on this as well. We hear a lot about the AI-enabled energy system of the future. What's real and what's hype today?
In a room full of people hyping. Look, I think carrying on from where Bernard was just, he was just talking about, the AI energy nexus that we're now all talking about is a brand new concept. And we started it out by, look, I didn't know anything about AI, and 2 years ago, I came into this because I sat in a couple of meetings and the heads of a number of the AI companies coming to the White House briefing, and I was interested. I sat in, and as the CEOs of the top hyperscalers in AI talking, and they're all saying, we're going to build a gigawatt cluster. And somebody says, the goal is a 5 gigawatt. And I'm starting like, wait a minute. You mean power, right? Like, where are we going to get this power, right? So that we got into the conversation, I entered into the AI conversation through the power angle of, this doesn't make any sense. We don't actually have this capability. And then people talk about the grid. I was like, we don't have the grid in the United States. We have multiple grids, and they don't all communicate with each other. And so one is the energy nexus is the energy that will be required to power AI, and without it, we will not be able to remain the lead. The second piece, as Bernard is talking about, is AI's impact on the energy industry itself, and which is significantly behind. If you look at AI integration into energy, and energy, I mean generic, right? So from power to pipelines to, and from power, I talk about generation, transmission, pipelines, production. We're still using, I mean, basically an abacus for some of how the trading of molecules and electrons are going. So I think the potential is enormous. The question becomes, what is financeable? Because we spend a lot of money on AI right now, but not a lot of AI makes money. So how much longer can we finance these things? And even on the question of the energy for AI, even there, we're talking now for 2 years about building out energy systems. We're not actually doing it because infrastructure finance is really, really scarce in the United States. And somebody has to take some of the, where's the cost gonna, who's gonna pay for it? And it's a very different kind of demand than we've ever seen. All our demand additions in the United States have been, or around the world, have been with advent of new technologies that said we'll have peaks. So I'm adding to peaks, right? So we start with appliances and electrification. This is a 7 days a week, 365 days a year, all day long. And so how do you build something that doesn't then cost the consumer? And I think AI is going to have to be part of the solution for even that question. I think we're nowhere near answering that. The easy thing to say, and I think I hear it a lot for the last 2 days, is we have to cut red tape. Okay, we've been talking for 25 years about cutting red tape. But a lot of the federal red tape has been cut. You have state, you have local, you have county, you have town, and you have cost. Somebody has to pay for this. And I think that's the conversation that we are having. My personal view is that the government has to play a much bigger role in this. I've heard Manhattan Project thrown around a lot around this, but the Manhattan Project was funded by the US government. I heard about this be a moonshot. Well, the moonshot was funded by the US government. So I'm not saying the US government should fund this, but it has to take a certain piece of this puzzle in order to lower the cost of capital and to incentivize the investment. And Congress doesn't want to spend it. The administration so far doesn't want to spend it. It's not their fault. I had a very hard time convincing our guys to do it as well in the Biden administration. But that's what's going to happen. If we want to stay ahead, that's the part that's not hype. If we want to make the hype real, we're going to have some kind of relationship here where the US government plays a role in incentivizing the investment to make this all happen.
This is a frontier technology, still really hard to de-risk for the private sector though, right?
Yes, that's what all frontier technologies have had that, but the difference is most frontier technologies to date started somewhere in the US government, whether it was known at the time or not, and then moved to the private sector. This started entirely in the private sector, and now the government has to figure out how to do that in an era when we're talking about cutting budgets and cutting spending. So I think there's a rationalization. I want to be the #1 in the world. I want to have the best technology, the best build out, the fastest build out, and who's my competitor? My competitor is a country that spends enormous amounts of money from the government and tells their companies, you don't have to be profitable at all, as long as you take dominant position. So we're in a mismatch with the people that we're competing against. And while we want to be dominant, that's a favorite word these days, while we want to be dominant, we don't want to make the investment to make it dominant. So then we're relying on 4 or 5 companies that have north of $1 trillion valuations that can do some of it, but nobody else can. So at some point, we have to decide, how do we want to make this not hype and make it real? And what's that relationship between what the government's going to do and what the private sector is going to do?
Bernard, come in on this as well, because obviously a huge lift up here. Put it into context for us, just the type of energy and the amount of energy that's going to be required to achieve the type of compute that we're actually talking about here.
Yeah, I mean, we throw around gigawatts and hundreds of megawatts, and I think all of us get confused, and it is just worth putting a few numbers in context. In 2026, the amount of energy going to data centers in the world will be the equivalent of the Japanese economy in terms of power consumption. Japanese economy is the 4th or 5th largest economy in the world. I think this year in the United States, we will add about 5 gigawatts to our data center capacity. Miami-Dade County, which I'm told is pretty big, is 2.5 gigawatts, so 2 Miami-Dade counties. So the numbers here are extraordinary. They really are extraordinary. I'm working on, with a team that's it's called Prometheus Hyperscale. We're developing what we hope will ultimately become a 4 to 5 gigawatt project in southwestern Wyoming. And I think it's, Amos, I think it's $30 to $50 billion per gigawatt for the entire system. So the numbers here are staggering. Now, what we're trying to do there is build the most efficient infrastructure that you can, because where is that power going to come from? 5 gigawatts, this is extraordinary. So the things that we're doing, we've got a liquid cooling technology that we think is going to be about half the power consumption of a traditional air-driven facility. We're using all types of energy, and Wyoming happens to be abundant. We have 2 natural gas pipelines on the property. We have extensive wind with high load factors. We also have a relationship for SMRs in the future with nuclear. So we will need all types of energy. We're building an island system so that we're not taking from the local grid, because it's simply too big. And actually over time, once we build that island, if we can connect it back to the grid, we can actually help the grid and supply some of the power back into the system. And there's existing wind infrastructure out there, which we will invest in repowering, back to the theme of making the current infrastructure as good as it can be. So these are the types of things that can be done and we must do, because the ambition is to win here in the United States. The ambition is to be the #1. As Amos says, you can't have a conversation with that without having a conversation about energy. And one way to manage that is to figure out how to get the biggest bang for your buck, so to speak, in terms of minimal inputs, maximize the output. And that's what I talk about in terms of minimizing that negative. How do we do that?
So when you put this into context as well, you were just giving us a comparison there with what 5 gigawatts is actually going to look like. This is 25x peak demand for Washington alone. It's the same amount of peak demand for the entire country of Ireland. It is the same peak
This
demand.
is very important, by the way, very important.
That you would see, the same peak demand that you would see in New Zealand on a day when New Zealand is up and firing with all the energy that it can get. What are the sources of energy that will be required in the future in order to get there? Because I think what we're looking at now is the possibility of an all of the above approach, which of course has its critics as well.
Yeah, I'll say a bit about that and just build on one thing that Amos said in the role of government. The simple answer is we're going to need genuinely every type of energy possible to help us do this. In our case, we're using natural gas, wind, nuclear, maybe some solar. But you're going to need it all. Okay, that's without question. So there is kind of not a lot of space for bad and good in this place. If we really want to do this, we're going to need it all. On the role of government, one thing I would add on top of what Amos was saying, if you look back to the space program of the 60s that Amos probably isn't familiar with, but people in the room might be. But here in the United States, I think what you'd find is that there was a huge government role focused on the technology around research, but importantly also, I believe, a hugely important government focus on skills. And we're seeing that already. In Texas today, we're running into shortages in this space around engineers, around technicians, around, I'm an electrical engineer, disciplines like that. And that's going to grow, Dan, over the coming years. So one thing that I absolutely believe is, you know, the whole area of STEM and focus on those skills, hugely important for this country, for any country, but for this country that wishes to achieve its goals. Because it's not just about finance, it's not just about the land, it's not just about the grid. Ultimately, these things all do come down to people. And we need the right skills to help us build the system. And we're going to have to invest more in them than maybe we have been.
It's a great point. Amos, wanted to come over to you on the investment question as well. TWG backing plays in energy infrastructure and AI. What type of companies or technologies are you betting on now and why?
So our thesis has been, first we launched an AI company, not data centers, but the application of AI. So it's an AI platform for financial services. We have a JV with Palantir, and we're using XAI as our technology partner for their data center access and so on. So, but as we look at it, I think we're going to need everything. I would say almost all of the above energy. I think we can do it without coal. And I hope we don't go backwards on that. But how do you look at, to me, I look at now investments in energy as, how do you get the Venn diagram of location, regulatory, an ease of regulatory approval areas, water, the access to the wellhead, the ability to create proximity, just as Leonard was talking about in Wyoming, there are other places. I think we talk a lot about, you know, where is AI going to be, where are we going to build the power plants, and then we talk about transmission. If we're talking about transmission, we're failing, is our view. And that's why the proximity matters. It's a lot easier to build the fiber optic and data cables than it is to build transmission in this country. So don't even try. So therefore, we have to look at the regions of the country that will enable that integration of energy to the data centers or to other things that are going to be coming down the pike. Remember that 5 years ago, nobody would be talking about AI, right? In 2012, we started talking about cloud, then we started talking about compute, now AI. And therefore, I don't know what the word is going to be to what it is that we're going to be saying in 5 years, but I do know that it's going to be power dependent and probably is going to require more power than whatever we're using now, because that's the direction of travel. And therefore, the investment I'm looking at is things that are commercially based, that are flexible enough, that can use a combination of gas and renewables, because again, we're talking about base load, all the stuff that you just talked about, the economies. None of that is base load, right? That is all peaks. So when you're talking about the economy of Ireland or Miami-Dade, that is not a constant. The data center needs that 5 gigawatts all day long and all night long. And so that's what makes it so different and so complicated. Now, the fear that I have in all of this is as we do this, and Bernard talking about doing it, either in front or behind the meter, what happens to consumers? If we're now going to say that companies are willing to pay a premium for electricity if they get it directly, well, they're going to pay a few cents more or 20 cents more, but that's going to become the new floor. So now all the consumers are going to be paying for that. So in an era where natural gas prices are as low as they've been for as long as this, really around hovering on the $3 a Henry Hub, and renewables are at 4 cents, and yet almost every American has seen their electricity bill go up. And this is why. Otherwise, they should be down, because the long-term contracts, as they expire, you get new ones, you're at these prices. We should be at lower prices, or at least static, but instead they're going up. And if we don't come up with more investments into the infrastructure side, we're going to see prices keep going up. As hyperscalers say, oh, my solution is to restart a nuclear power plant that has been mothballed for 40 years, that used to be affected the psyche of the country in 3 Mile Island, now talking about bringing it back. That's not cheap. That's not cheap electrons. That means consumers are going to pay for this. So that's the reason I bring this all back again. We have to look as a private sector into investing into this, and we'll find things. Vern's going to find it. We're finding things to invest in. But those are anecdotes. If you want this across the country, and now outside the country, this is the Global Energy Forum, where are these things going to be done around the world? And are we going to create, again, a haves and have-nots on energy as we always have? So how are you going to build this out without raising the costs constantly? And then we're going to have a whole new conversation on energy justice and so on, equality. These are the things governments are going to have to worry about.
That's the key question as well. And Bernard, just on the investment question too, take us inside XRG. What is the investment thesis? What is the problem you're attempting to solve, and what's your edge?
XRG is fantastic. It's very exciting. It's Dr. Sultan's ambition is to build the energy company of the future. The investment thesis is based around 3 global themes. Number one, the global south, and the fact that we have billions of people around the world who don't have the standard of living that we aspire to. I think the number is either 70 or 80% of people in the world have never been on a plane. So number one, it's about the global south and how we help them achieve our level of prosperity. Number two, it's about the changing nature of the energy system. We've been talking about that. And number 3, it's about artificial intelligence. So they're the 3 macro trends that drive XRG's raison d'etre, so to speak. We're focused on chemicals, we're focused on energy solutions, and we're focused on natural gas. And our edge, everybody, of course, would say that that it's about the ambition and the resources of the UAE. And I would agree, of course, there's incredible ambition. There always has been. This is the country that opened Masdar City in 2005 or 6. The Paris Climate Agreement was 2016. This is the country who had the world's first minister for AI in 2016, the world's first and only university dedicated to AI in 2018. As Amos rightly said, most of us didn't know anything about AI a few years ago. These guys were way ahead. So yes, they have ambition. Yes, they have resources. But much more importantly, I think, the UAE has decades. Energy is in their DNA. Decades of experience and know-how, both technical, operational, and financial. They also have a deep-rooted belief in partnerships, and that is not just talk. They have partnerships with some of the largest companies in the world that have spanned 40, 50 years. So you put that together, and you've got this incredible vehicle that is at the intersection of capital, smart capital, and industrial knowledge. And it makes it a very unique proposition. And it's one that I think, and I believe that you'll be hearing much more about in the coming months and years.
We'll certainly be watching very closely. I wish we had more time, but we'll have to leave the conversation there. Amos, Bernard, thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you all in the room for joining in as well. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats. Our next panel will begin momentarily. Please remain in your seats. Thank you. Please welcome our next panel, Technological Innovations to Advance Energy Prosperity, moderated by Ben-Hur Shargil, non-resident senior fellow, Global Energy Center, Atlantic Council, and Global Head of Grid Edge, Wood Mackenzie. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think this panel is going to pick up right where the previous one left off. I'm pleased to be joined by some of the people who are right in the middle, leadership of some of the companies directly in the center of all the topics we've been discussing today and will be tomorrow. We'll be talking about some of the challenges in geopolitical fragmentation, supply chains, and how the companies represented by the leadership here are trying to enable a reliable and sustainable powering of new load that is happening in the US and around the world. So I'd like to introduce Tim Holt, member of the Executive Board of Siemens Energy, Judith Judson, Senior Vice President of Energy, Vantage Data Centers, Daniel Droege, Vice President, Power Solutions at Chevron New Energies, and Jennifer Ganton, Chief Global Affairs Officer with Commonwealth Fusion Systems. Welcome, all of you. So, Tim, let me start with you. How is Siemens Energy navigating the challenges posed by this fragmentation of trade policy and supply chains, especially for your global transformer and turbine manufacturing businesses?
So maybe, tariffs, disruption of supply chain is currently the talk of the town. But I think we should always keep in mind this is not something new. If you work as a global company, you always face tariffs, you always face supply chain interruption. And I think also when we have these discussions, I caution everybody, if you're doing business on a global basis, this is something that you need to get used to, that you have to have the right risk management processes and tools in place to deal with it. I think what we have seen, and it started actually with COVID, then followed with the Ukraine war, supply chains are global, they are diverse, and they're really complex. And I think some of us have read the book, The World is Flat, 2005, Friedman, saying, the world is global supply chains. I think what we've learned, it's not that easy. And we have seen that it's not just the suppliers you have, but also the second or third or even fourth tier suppliers can disrupt your supply chains severely. So in the last, and it started 4 years ago, what we started to do is look more at not where we can always buy the cheapest. And, I think all of us work in large corporations, single source supplier, going to best cost countries, but to also look what happens if part of the supply chain is disrupted. How do we make sure we keep the factories running? How do we make sure we can do deliveries to our customers? And then just given the recent boom, so we had the supply chain disruption, we had the geopolitical disruption, and then we had this huge demand, both on the power side, but also on the grid side. And when you look at expansions, then where do you plan your factories? How do you build up the supply chain? So a couple things we did. We started going to invest 1.2 billion in expanding our grid factory network. We're going to build a factory here in Charlotte, North Carolina, for large power transformers. Some of you know 83% of the large power transformers in the US get imported from outside the US. So with the market and the market demand, we see this really makes a lot of sense. Same, that factory also used to produce gas turbines. And I remember when I started, the gas turbine market, it was like 185 large gas turbines a year, went to 300. In the last years before the AI boom, it went down to 70 a year. And that's how we sized also the supply chain. And now with AI, we're back to 185 and rising and rising. So we're also looking at how can we revitalize the US factory network. But also, it's not just what we do. You also have to have the supply chain that goes with it. And I think that's the big part when we look at how do we get the supply chain. It's copper, steel, forgings. How do we find that also in the regions where we do business? And then get the whole ecosystem up and running to meet the demand.
So Judith, how is the data center industry weathering this supply chain set of challenges? I know your company uses strategic procurement to try to stay ahead of things. Could you talk a little bit about that? And what are the kinds of policies that you would like to see to minimize that kind of risk in the future?
Yeah, thank you. And it's great to be here. So Vantage Data Centers, we're on, in 5 different continents. We have about 3 gigawatts of data center capacity today, and that is scaling very, very fast. And we're building all over North America and, have a significant presence in the tier 1 markets for data centers. And we serve the hyperscalers. So as we think about supply chain, our customers generally almost always want what can we deliver in 12 to 18 months, sometimes up to 24 months, but it is a very quick turnaround. And I come from the power side of the industry, and so this scale and pace that we see in data centers is just unmatched to what's today on the power side. So we are making strategic procurements. We've always done that for our data centers in terms of key components that enable our data centers to serve. But now on the energy side, we're doing that with high side breakers, with transformers, with turbines. We are getting the equipment needed to ensure that we can have power when our customers are requesting it. In terms of policy, I do think, there's something to be said for, we have had strategic reserves. We have had policies to support supply chains for critical infrastructure and critical energy infrastructure. And as the AI evolution is happening, we need to ensure that we have the critical infrastructure to build out our power supply very quickly.
Okay, so Daniel, we have Chevron on stage and a panel focused on power. Could you walk us through your new strategy for power and kind of how you bring the expertise from your core business to this new business and sort of the solutions that you're bringing to market? Talk about the breadth of the portfolio, including how the kind of carbon neutral and other technologies are playing a role, including potentially carbon capture.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Thanks for including me. Chevron has a long relationship with the Atlantic Council, so it's great to be part of the conversation today. This is a extension for us in some ways into a new third-party business. But what we're bringing to that is 5 gigawatts of our own development experience deploying this exact solution into our base business. And that's really an unrivaled set of expertise and capabilities. Combining that with our asset base, including our natural gas supply and trading network, our upstream assets, our downstream facilities, and our positions in the marketplace, but also our land positions. And then a queue of partnerships we have with GE on the equipment side and Engine One, private equity firm on the development side. So we're focused on bringing together that set of assets and capabilities to deliver at a speed that is now. It's this delivery window of 26 to 28, which is very hard to achieve based on everything the other panelists mentioned, and at a scale that's the 1 gigawatt plus scale, which is really focused on what the customer needs. So the speed and scale being unrivaled in what's available in the market, then to really unlock value that's good for the customer because it helps them bring certainty to the amount of CapEx that they're putting on the GPU side. Good for the consumer because this is added generation. I think the panel we heard just before, this level of generation helps address the pricing concerns that both policymakers and consumers are concerned about. And then overall, good for the country and staying in the AI race on a national security standpoint and staying ahead of it. We're bringing all that along with our 2.5 decades really of investment on the decarbonization side. So pairing that with the CCUS business, pairing that with our own renewable development that we've done in sites that are available for our customer base. We've done significant work. We have the largest hydrogen blending project in the United States. So expanding these decarbonization offerings that allow the customer to secure the scale and the speed they need, and then continue to work on the carbon trajectory. And I know we've got other panelists who are better positioned to talk about small scale SMR and how the whole ecosystem plays out. But our view is you need an all of the above solution. And we're really trying to meet the moment with both speed and scale that brings our capacity and our asset base to unlock value for the customers.
So I think it's really interesting you talk about speed and scale as sort of the emphasis. I think speed is something that is a common refrain here, but there's also in scale, there's time scales, and there's sort of what happens today and what happens in the 2030s and onward. And so Jennifer, I think there's a lot of anticipation about what fusion technology can provide in the future. I was hoping you can kind of level set for the rest of us who are not deep in the topic. What is the state of the technology, and when should we expect fusion to be powering the grid in the future?
Yeah, thank you so much for the invite to come today. And I was at the ENACT meeting yesterday and then today's meeting, and what I've been pleasantly surprised about is I think fusion has come up on every panel. I think there's a lot of expectation. It's a really exciting time for the industry because we're on the cusp of creating a distinct new industry, fusion energy, that has the potential to be huge. But we're at those early stages. And so I'll tell you a little bit about CFS's timeline and the path that we're on. We believe we're on the sort of surest, fastest path to demonstrate fusion energy on the grid. We're using a pretty traditional technology that has very little physics risks, and it relies a lot more on engineering risk and material risk in all honesty, which we're working through. So we were spun out of MIT in 2018, and we're moving at the pace of private sector. So fusion had always been a science kind of focused endeavor through national labs and universities. And just in the past 5-10 years, we've seen a tremendous amount of private capital flowing in and a lot of fusion companies starting up. We're one of those. So in the past few years, we've been able to raise $2 billion and demonstrate a core piece of that technology. And now we are building a fusion demonstration plant outside of Boston, Massachusetts. We have been making the core component of that, which is a magnet for our technology, and our magnet factory for nearly 2 years now. And we are about 60% complete in finalizing and beginning the assemblies of the actual machine. So we're going to turn that on next year. And soon after that, we're going to show that you can get more power out than in from this design of a fusion power plant. So we're on the cusp of something really important to show that this is a technology that works. we have been, because it's private capital, we can put lots of things at risk. So while we hadn't even tested the magnet, and we started construction on our machine in Boston called Spark. We haven't turned Spark on yet, but we are already working to build our first fusion power plant that will put watts on the grid. That is called ARC. So in December, we made an announcement with Governor Glenn Youngkin that we're going to site that just south of Richmond, Virginia, in Chesterfield County. We found an incredibly receptive county, state government, community to be excited about the first fusion power plant. So we'll start construction 27, 28, anticipation early 2030s. We're going to turn the plant on, and we're going to put 400, it's a 400 megawatt net electric capacity plant, and we will be putting electrons in the grid. So that's the CFS story. And we intentionally made a decision on the technology to go fast because we think it's important that you can demonstrate this is a viable technology. There are now over 40 private fusion companies. We've amassed more than probably $7-8 billion in capital. It keeps growing every month. People are raising more and more money every month. It's global. It used to be predominantly US companies. We now have 4 private fusion companies in Germany. And so we're seeing, and there's an industry association that stood up a couple years ago, the Fusion Industry Association, and they do a survey every year. So when we talk about timelines, I give you our timelines, and we have high confidence we're going to be able to meet those. But probably, half of those fusion companies are saying they're going to have things on the grid in the 2030s as well. So lots of different approaches. We'd like to think with 40 different companies out there and 40 different approaches, quite a few of them will make it across the line in the 2030s. So it's an exciting time to see fusion energy finally come into the mix as an option for countries to consider of a clean baseload power.
Well, I think Virginia makes a whole lot of sense as a place to start. I've heard they need a lot of generation there.
Yeah, there were a lot of reasons we chose it. That was in there.
Right. So Judith, one of the key questions here, I've heard all kinds of talk on stage and off stage about behind the meter powering of large loads, especially data centers. So in our research, we've seen a lot of projects that languish in the queue, don't make it through all the way. You are a company that has actually successfully deployed one of these projects. I was hoping you could kind of educate the rest of us in what are the real opportunities, but also the challenges of powering a data center behind the meter. And what should we expect? Is there truly a trend where this will become at scale, or will grid dependence remain the status quo for data centers?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm excited to talk about it. We, in Virginia, we found ourselves in a situation with one of our data centers where we were expecting grid power to come on and then found out it was significantly delayed. And so we very quickly pivoted and now have running, and it took about 12 to 18 months, got a power on-site, 100 megawatt on-site power plant built with DPS, who provided a natural gas turbine solution. And it's all about speed. And we didn't, our customers really do want grid power. They like paying a utility bill. It reads the meter. It's, and they pay what it says. It's a pass-through for our customers. And, but the world is changing. We're not getting interconnected fast enough. We are needing to look at solutions where we build power generation to support our data centers. And, the hope is either that's a bridge to a connected grid future, or that asset stays online and gets connected. And actually everywhere where we have introduced the concept of behind the meter generation, we have been asked by the utility, could that, come online in front of the meter? So we'd love to see policies where supporting if a data center, a large load of any type is bringing its own generation, that it's able to go faster into the queue. And that's a real win-win, because data centers need a tremendous amount of reliability. We run 24/7. So an islanded solution has a lot of redundancy built in, a lot of, and there's additional capacity there to ensure that we never go offline. When those resources to connect to the grid, they could be serving other customers in addition to us. So there's a lot of synergies, and it also solves another issue of, utilities are asking, is this load going to be there if we build these resources? Well, we're already up and running with an on-site resource. It definitely proves the load is there. So we need to enable this to happen. We also have a strategic partnership with VoltaGrid, and we're working with many different providers so that we can just have power as soon as we need it, and hopefully the grid catches up.
So I think, you mentioned your partnership with VoltaGrid. Partnerships are key in this. And Tim, I was hoping you could speak a little bit about Siemens Energy's partnership with Eaton in developing solutions to, yes, speed up time to power for data centers. Are there other innovations that your company is pursuing, particularly around manufacturing and getting this kind of critical equipment to all of these companies who need it?
So when you look at our portfolio at Siemens Energy, I always say, we provide the plug into the data center. So we have the generation technologies, we also have the high voltage, and then it stops. And then, of course, you have the other side, the data center that has the low or medium voltage, and it has to come together. So what we have seen is, and a lot of times the discussion from the customer base is they don't want to talk to one to build the data center and then one to do the grid access technology or potentially even on-site power generation. Other partnerships where somebody says, here's a solution, we can provide you both. And that's how we had the discussion with Eaton. It's non-exclusive, so we're talking to others as well. But for us, it's a way in the industry to provide exactly what you said. If the customer says, hey, I have to wait X months for the grid connection, I want to make sure that I can go to one person or one company or consortium to get that solution, and it's optimized to what I need. It's not just, I get like two different pieces and then I have to, like a Lego, somehow put it together and it has to look good afterwards. So we're going to see more and more on that side across the board as the data centers get larger and as the grid gets more and more constrained. I think there's other different partnerships that we see coming. We always talk, the data center goes where the power is, right? And then you have molecules there as natural gas, you convert them and then it goes into the data center. You could actually also bring the electrons to the data center. And we have a lot of HVDC discussion where we do the long distance. So you could actually also bring the electrons to the data center depending on the siting. We also have partnerships where we're in Europe. It's predominantly discussion: can we build a DC grid to use the generation in different regions of Europe, based also on renewables, solar, wind, and then how do we get it to where the load is needed? So that's one. I think the other technology that we see, a bigger and bigger need is really how do we deal with grid fluctuations, power quality, and I think that's a bit also the discussion. The data center, ramps up and down depending on the size and what they do inside the data center. You can see drops in load of several hundred megawatts multiple times a minute. Mm-hmm. So the question is, do you trust somebody who operates a data center and says, I solve it with software so that the racks kind of go in sync and keep the stable frequency, or is that the utility? So on that side, we also see a lot of movement. And then maybe to your question, in partnerships going forward, I think we're only going to evolve this industry if we do partnerships. We do it with Rolls-Royce on the SMRs. We do it with Mitsubishi on the HVDC, with Eaton on the data centers. I think the pie is so big and the challenges is so immense that we have to come together as an industry. Everybody has their strengths on certain parts of the value chain. But in order to get that speed into the equation that we need, the 12 months, it only works with partnerships and doing it together.
You said speed again. I need to throw a nickel in a jar every time someone says speed.
Yeah.
Daniel, you mentioned, you sort of touched on briefly your partnership with GE Vernova and engine number one. I was hoping you could expand a little bit on that. Where are you guys today, and what do you need from policymakers, from regulators, from your customers to enable you to achieve this sort of speed and scale that you spoke of?
So I agree that partnerships and collaboration are key to this, because there's different pieces of the value chain that have to come together and come together quickly. And it's not just speed either, right? It's scale, and then it's the long-term reliability and quality of the of the offering. So where we are today, we have equipment packages, we have engineering, we have sites, we have gas supply, we have the ingredients or the puzzle pieces that we're working with customers on, where is the best fit. On the second part of your question, and I'll try to be quick, I'm trying to figure out like how to face the audience when you sit in the middle. I feel like we should be on a rotating stage at a concert. But I'll turn to the second part of your question on what do we need. Because yesterday and this morning, there's been conversation on that here in Washington, D.C. And I just think we need to be clear and direct and somewhat simple. I think what we need on the policy side is clarity. Judith mentioned the idea that those who bring new cogeneration should have clarity on the permitting pathway and the interconnection pathway. Clarity to match the speed they need. I think from the customer side, commitment. The window's now to get this scale of power in a 27, 28 delivery time window. The commitment from the customers now. The customers that are committing are going to win. They're going to have the power. And others are not going to have it. It's a very competitive race. So I think commitment from the customer, the ball is really in their court, I think in this window of time. And then the third thing, and I would put this back on those of us that are providers and in the industry, we need to be competitive. We cannot deliver things into a system that increases consumer prices or is uncompetitive from an economic standpoint at the national level. So clarity on policy, on the interconnection, on the permitting timeline, commitment from the customer, and then a competitive solution that unlocks value for the economy and for the nation.
Yeah, that's clear. You know, in our conversations with utilities, they've sort of, on the one hand, said, yes, we welcome local power generation because in some cases that's the only way we can interconnect a project. At the same time, we say, well, how transparent is your process for interconnecting loads? They say, not transparent by design. So to your point of needing that kind of transparency. I guess to open up the conversation a little bit geographically, Jennifer, how do you see globally different markets being sort of prepared, the right fit for your technology? Where should we expect to see you deployed beyond, let's say, in the US?
Yeah, it's so interesting that we parallel the exact same needs, even with a new technology.
It's almost like we used to work together.
It's almost like we used to work together. I was at Chevron for many years before CFS. We think about fusion we've thought about fusion on a global basis since day one of the company. It was really kind of the ethos of the founders to say, how do we create a product that A, is cost competitive in the market? You don't win unless you're truly cost competitive. You're not living on subsidies or anything. You know, you can compete on $1 per kilowatt hour. And what do you need in place that can help you do that? And that is a scalable machine. So the fundamentals of what we do, and I'll get to the policy, regulation, and global deployment, but how are we going to do that globally? We designed our fusion power plant as a machine. Everybody gets the same one. And you brought this up yesterday when we were having a discussion with the UAE, that if you can do that, you can get the economies of scale, you can have gigafactories. So we've done the math and figured out, okay, a few gigafactories, we can make all the magnets we need for thousands of fusion power plants deployed by 2050. And so if everybody's getting a 400 megawatt machine, if you need a gigawatt, you put two next to each other. So we thought about scale very early because we thought about global deployment. Fusion technology, when we look at the demand curves, we see AI playing a big role in that, but we also are thinking globally because the standard of living is not equal around the planet, and it deserves to be. And so part of what we want to do is to be able to deploy that. So we're thinking about all these things. We're building a business model that should work, and we will be competitive in the marketplace. But we're starting here in the U.S. And why is that? And that came down to regulations, actually. So if you're not familiar with the fusion industry, fusion is very, very different than fission, but it is a nuclear process. So we are regulated by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC. And we spent about 4 years educating the NRC on the differences between fission and fusion. Why does that matter? 2 years ago, they made a decision not to regulate fusion power plants like fission plants because the safety profile is so different. We don't have chain reactions. We don't have the long-lived waste. There's just not the hazards that are associated with the entire plant in a fission plant managing the public risk. It's a much narrower set of things that need to be regulated in a fusion plant. So that win resulted in a much faster time to get licensing. We licensed our plant in Massachusetts in 1 year through the NRC. And then much lower cost, as you can imagine. We're talking from $1 billion it could be to license a fission plant to tens of millions of dollars. So that factors into your ability to scale and develop quickly. There's only 2 countries that have regulations for fusion in place right now that treat fusion more like a particle accelerator than a fission plant that provides that pathway and the economics that come with that. That's the UK and the US. So when we started looking for our very first fusion plant, we narrowed the search down to the UK and the US for that reason. It was important they had certainty. We had certainty on what the regulatory pathway was and how much it was going to cost. What we have found, though, is fusion is now on the radar of many governments. I have a team that spends time going around the world meeting with governments on fusion policy and regulation, and the Japanese, the Canadians, the Germans, they're all writing fusion policy and regulation. They are investing into the industry. And so where the next market is, I think we're a commercial company, so we'll be driven a lot by our customers and where they want to see them and who's willing to pay for them. The capital is an important part of this. We're a private company. We are building ARC with private capital. So we'll have to think through a lot of complexities there. But fusion is on the radar of many countries. So as soon as we have our ability to start scaling more rapidly in the late 2030s into the 40s, I think you'll start to see this globally deploying.
Okay, very exciting. I think, we talked a lot about the supply side here and some of the big hopes and the big plans for the future. I think one really exciting part of the challenge we face today is that we're starting to talk about the demand side too. It's not just the supply side. And so Judith, I wanted to ask you, another big sort of ambitious thing is to make data centers flexible. It's a traditionally inflexible business. There's a lot of mission critical workloads that run and cloud companies don't want to mess with them. There has been talk about the potential of making them more flexible. You're a major co-location provider. You work with so many data center companies. From your view, what is the potential and the feasibility of really making that work? And what would need to happen to enable that kind of flexibility?
Yeah, that is a great question, and we've heard a lot about that. We do operate 24/7. So this idea of shifting, within a day, peak to off peak, I think there's challenges with doing that because our load, it may fluctuate with AI now a lot faster. It tends to be fairly stable and around 20, across the day. We do have cooling. We have other loads. So in the summer, usage can go up. And that's where there's some opportunity. And we have been working with utilities, particularly in the Southwest, where we do demand response. And we have our data centers are fully backed up by on-site generators. So we have the ability to operate those on very peak days and relieve the grid. And that can be a real way to just enable more capacity quickly because the grid is modeled for that very, very peak hour and tends to have a lot of capacity that isn't needed for all the other times. So we think a demand response type application is definitely something we can look at. We do need support then with permitting and being able to operate those on-site generators. I mean, there's a lot of latent capacity that with reduced permitting and regulatory hurdles, we could really leverage. And this is one of the very near-term opportunities to do that.
Okay, yeah, interesting. I guess, Daniel, we've heard a lot about the key role that natural gas is going to play to meet this sort of increase in demand. But I think many also acknowledge that the speed at which we can deploy turbines and other critical equipment may not allow it to meet all of demand growth. And so there's going to be, well, really a question for you, what is the role of other types of generation technologies? I mean, you mentioned you operate a significant power portfolio for your own core business. So renewables, geothermal in the future, what do you see as the other key components of a sustainable portfolio of generation?
So I think it's really an all of the above strategy. And then when you take that analysis to the US, we're incredibly advantaged, right? Because there's enormous natural gas resources. We have a very vibrant technology base. We have companies who are advancing the next level of fusion. So our perspective is we're going to see all of the above. Right now, we're the beneficiary of a pretty significant build out of renewables. Now there's an intermittency issue with renewables. So bringing in additional gas baseload supply pairs really nice with the mix in of renewables that are already on the grid. Chevron's very significant leaseholder for geothermal leases now. We're working kind of on taking the same breakthroughs that we've experienced in our drilling campaigns for oil and gas and applying those in kind of that next generation of geothermal, increasing the productivity, reducing the cost, so you can deliver more value to the customer. SMRs, heard from Jennifer and the team just about a more modular approach that can be adapted over time. I think all of these things can play in. And then I wouldn't underestimate just the application of AI itself, right? What can you do on the demand side? I'm pushing the limits of AI for a team that's focused on a customer base in AI. I want our team to be using AI in every way possible. And I think the energy industry, and Chevron specifically, has a lot of value unlock just on the application of AI to the finding, the exploration, the production, the safety increase, and the overall productivity of energy through AI. So I think it's an exciting time. I think it's a time where making decisions, making commitments to unlock value, I think will really create a lot of momentum. And the good news here is there's win-win-win. There's a win for a customer base, there's a win for the consumer base, and there's a win for the country. So I think an all of the above approach really makes sense. And I didn't mention it because others have mentioned it, but it really provides a window of opportunity to do some of the grid investment that has been needed, but either hasn't been done because you have a supply side issue or a demand side issue. Making those match up and really doing some of the long-term grid investment, I think, is a big national priority that can be met during this window as well.
Yeah, I mean, national transmission policy and sort of getting the grid build out is definitely a core priority. You mentioned sort of the self-referential nature of AI, where it's both the sort of cause of energy demand, but also a potential solution to it. So Tim, there's one technology that I can think of that could disrupt AI. It could have beat it at its own game, and that's quantum computing. I was hoping you could take a minute and just talk through Siemens Energy's sort of view on the opportunities, the disruptions. What is your view on it? How disruptive will it be? How could you harness it?
Maybe I start with the problem I want to solve and then see if it fits or not. And I mean, you talk, we need all of the above of the generation sources and technologies. At the end, you always have to get an electron from A to B, right? I mean, that's when we talk about grid and how do you make sure the electron is not where it's generated, but where it's needed. And there's a lot of inefficiencies in today's grid. And we talked about it's built for peak load. We have curtailment at one point where energy prices go negative because there's no load. And the problem we're trying to solve is, and on the digital grid, how do you get a self-driving grid? How do you get a grid that automatically routes the electron from where it's generated where the need is? And I think with data center, with a constant demand, that problem even becomes bigger. And I always compare it's like a self-driving car, right? I mean, there's a lot of technology in it. You need sensors, but you also need software how to route it. It starts with, can I, a transformer? How much load can I get through the transformer? We're looking at AI to solve it, build a foundation model of the transformer to see how I can get more through the individual assets. Next is the substation and the lines. Do we have a digital twin? How do we get more through that system? And then on top sits actually the layer of the software. We actually have a cooperation with NVIDIA to solve it with AI to start building the individual pieces. But the question is also, do we get there with AI? So that's also why we talk, on quantum computing with one of the providers to say, maybe there's an alternative solution to solve the problem that I have. To be very open, we're just getting, our toes in the water, because it's not like quantum computing. You go in front of a computer, you start programming, and then something magic happens out of it. You have to actually learn how to program it, how do you state the problem, and how do you find, how should this problem being solved by quantum computing? So engineers are just in the discussion of really describing the problem that we can run a pilot to see how that compares to how we do it with AI. I think the challenge is so big if we want to solve it, and if we want to get the grid more efficient without adding all this, new equipment, because I think at the end it's going to become an affordability issue, that we're kind of going parallel. AI currently the more promising path because it's much more accessible and usable, but quantum computing is the other venue that I said, let's try it out, let's see how far we get, let's do a couple use cases. Might not be the right technology to do it, but for us, it's at least try it out until we get told, no, it's not going to work.
Okay, I think we have to leave it there. So please join me in thanking our panelists.
Ladies and gentlemen, our next program will take place shortly. Please take your seats. Thank you. Please welcome the Leadership Spotlight, moderated by Executive Vice President of the Atlantic Council, Jenna Ben-Yehuda.
We could have sat a little bit closer, I think, but
It suggests a certain
we're well
distance has
mic'd.
come between us.
So, we'll do some ping pong here. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jenna Ben-Yehuda. I'm the Executive Vice President here at the Atlantic Council. Thank you so much for joining this Leadership Spotlight with Senator Chris Coons, shaping U.S. strategy in a global energy landscape, one that's changing so rapidly. Really delighted to be here with you, Mr. Senator. Senator Coons was elected to the Senate in 2010. He is co-chair of the Senate Climate Solutions Caucus, a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, also committees on appropriations, judiciary, small business and entrepreneurship, and ethics. That's a lot of committees. And in April of this year, Senator Coons traveled with Senator Ricketts and Senator Budd to Taiwan and the Philippines to meet with top officials to discuss energy security and strategy in the Indo-Pacific. That was following a prior trip with another congressional delegation to Moldova and Romania to assess the impact of Russian interference with democracy and critical infrastructure. And Senator Coons has consistently demonstrated his leadership on energy security issues and brings a critical perspective to today's discussion. Thank you so much for joining us. We are going to jump right in. The theme of the forum this year is collaboration, competition, and security, a new era of leadership shaping the future of global security system. So as a reminder, this is on the record and we are being live streamed and recorded. You've been warned. So Senator Coons, you're used to that. You've been working on international energy issues for a long time, but I would wager that the current moment offers a new high watermark for geopolitical instability during your Senate tenure. We have a land war in Europe with Russia's war in Ukraine, a new war between Iran and Israel unfolding truly by the minute, growing tensions with China, and a global sprint for the commanding heights of technological change. Each of these dynamics carries enormous importance and consequence for the United States. Help us unpack the current moment. What does it mean for the U.S. and U.S. energy leadership, and what's at stake?
Jenna, thank you for that concise and brief question that I can answer in just a sentence.
You got it.
I'll just briefly say thank you to the Atlantic Council and to you, to my dear friend and former colleague, Senator Landrieu. I first served on the Energy and Natural Resources Committee when it was in her firm hands, and learned about how to bridge some of the divides between our political parties by looking more broadly in terms of the long-term national security interests of the United States and how to deliver our resources both for our security and for the world, while also being, the one thing you didn't mention, attentive to an energy transition that needs to address long-term climate crisis concerns. I'll say this: abundant, affordable baseload power is essential to America's national security. I worked in manufacturing for 8 years. The thing that makes manufacturing move to a particular state or country is cheap, reliable, secure baseload power, period. For decades, we have had the world's leading nuclear technology, yet our regulatory structure and some of the restrictions on exports and financing have really prevented us from being a leader in nuclear globally. So I'm just going to focus on that point if I can.
Please.
I led a bipartisan CODEL to Moldova, Romania, also to Slovakia and Poland, and looking across a number of our critical European partners. They want to work with the United States. We have global competitors, Korea, China, others, Russia certainly, for nuclear technology. We've got a moment of opportunity here. There is genuine bipartisan support for the next generation of U.S. nuclear technology, and we should take advantage of this moment. I have 4 different bipartisan nuclear bills. 2 of them have to do with exporting the technology and financing the exports. These 4 bills are with 4 different Republicans, and they recognize the moment that we are in, where the United States can work closely with our European partners. They recognized when Russia invaded Ukraine that over-reliance on Russian gas, cheap, abundant Russian gas, made them strategically vulnerable. We need to help fill that moment. The most recent trip you referenced, the one with Senator Ricketts to the Philippines and Taiwan. Taiwan is also critically energy dependent and needs support as it tries to figure out its energy security for the future. And we have huge opportunities in the Indo-Pacific and in Europe for U.S. exports of LNG, but I think more critically for U.S. exports of nuclear technology.
Well, thanks for that laydown. I want to dig into 2 of these pieces of legislation, which you noted all of them have bipartisan co-sponsorship. The first is the International Nuclear Energy Act. It's an INEA. has a good ring to it, together with Senator Risch of Idaho. And the second is International Nuclear Energy Financing Act, the financing side of this, with Pennsylvania Senator and former Atlantic Council Board Chair Dave McCormick. Can you tell us a little bit more about these bipartisan pieces of legislation? What are they really working to address? You talked a little bit about exports. I'd love you to unpack that for us.
So the Financing Act with Dave McCormick, the House lead is the Financial Services Chair, French Hill. And this follows on the World Bank announcing the end of their ban on financing. And this just helps unlock some of our critical export financing ability. One of the things not marked here for me to talk about at this moment, but that I've been very involved in is the Development Finance Corporation,
Right.
Which is a critical resource for our export finance. Between EXIM and DFC, we can and should be competing with countries that have historically done a lot more of so-called industrial policy to help finance the export of their critical technologies. President Trump says we want to reshore manufacturing and we want to win in the technologies of the 21st century. We have for decades failed to build or open any significant new nuclear facilities, just a handful. Yeah. Between AI and the dramatic increase in power needs generated by AI and the need for clean energy sources that are not intermittent, I think there's a huge moment of opportunity here. And if we take advantage of exporting our technology, the first bill, financing the export of that technology, the second bill, we open up a window for American manufacturing and for the companies that are responsible for that technology to be able to finance and build overseas as well.
We heard from Dr. Sultan, CEO of ADNOC from the United Arab Emirates this morning, that you can't run tomorrow's technology on today's grid, right? It's a great line. So it looks like you're looking to address the full kind of spectrum of this. Can you talk to us a little bit about what the World Bank decision really means and what this unlocks in this moment?
Not with any knowledge or depth. But being a senator, I can't avoid an opportunity to speak. So I recently met with the head of the IMF. I have spoken regularly to the head of the World Bank. What I think it means is the beginning of the MDBs, of a variety of different financial institutions changing their position on nuclear. And the United States needs to lead or be a part of that change. One of my four bills also directs the United States Treasury to use our vote in different multinational lending systems and institutions to support the export of U.S.-Canadian nuclear technology. And this is both for the 50-year-old light water reactor technology that is well characterized, as well as the next generation nuclear technology that is of great interest to a lot of countries around the world and where we can and should be at the forefront of commercializing and deploying it.
And so you noted, I think this is really quite unique in this moment, that these pieces of legislation on nuclear energy have bipartisan support. You have strong bipartisan co-sponsors. That's no small feat in these deeply polarized times.
I picked up on that, yes.
Yeah, I did. What does that say about this? Is there a bipartisan nuclear energy consensus? I'd love to hear what that looks like and how you've experienced it.
There is and there should be. Look, I'm from Delaware, and my senior senator for a long time was Senator Tom Carper, who, because he'd served in the U.S. Navy, had a pro-nuclear bent his entire elected career. So when I joined the Senate 15 years ago, I was perhaps unusual as a Democrat in being part of a delegation that had a leader who was really inclined to support nuclear. I trained as a chemist. I worked in an engineering-led manufacturing company, so I've always been more open to complex technological solutions. The unresolved issue of waste and how to manage nuclear waste has long been a real stumbling block. But Franz Werfmannsdobler, who was my first energy policy advisor, sort of laid out for me Daniel Yergin's analysis of baseload generation and what the trends of the next 50 years are likely to look like. There is no way to achieve the climate goals of the left without nuclear. There is no way to achieve the manufacturing and the economic and the national security goals of the right without nuclear. And I think having finally realized that has brought together left and right folks who've previously been opponents for a variety of reasons. It's a technology largely developed and invented and deployed in the United States initially. Obviously, France, probably the leader in Europe, but a dozen countries around the world, but we really have a leading position. It's a technology where our national labs and our private sector have a possibility of competing successfully, but no guarantee. And it's a technology that is a critical bridge. Right after this, I'm returning to the Hill for the latest of our bipartisan climate solutions caucus sessions to explore geothermal. Fervo Energy is a company that's applying the fracturing technology that makes fracking work to geothermal. Geothermal, like nuclear, is a carbon zero baseload power generating technology, but with this breakthrough in geothermal, it may be deployable much more broadly, because historically it had to be on the side of a volcano for it to, I'm joking, but basically yes.
Sort of, yeah.
There's very few geologies where geothermal works. This expands dramatically where it can work. My concern about American next generation nuclear is that there's a lot of doubters and a lot of skepticism, like this is the technology that's always going to be 10 years away. It no longer is. It is deployable, but without American bipartisan commitment to financing and permitting and licensing, it won't happen. We shouldn't let this moment pass us by.
Yeah, and I'm hearing from you, Senator, that especially given the capital intensive nature of these builds, you need some consistency. Folks need to be able to plan on a continuous policy for those investments. I want to go back to some of your recent travels, back to Romania and Moldova, where you were assessing Russian activities and interference in the region. Russia, of course, cut off all gas supplies to Moldova this year, and Romania now supplies almost 3/4 of Moldova's gas. How can the U.S. support Romania and Moldova in meeting this energy needs?
So I don't know how familiar these countries and their configuration are. I'll try to be brief. Moldova and Georgia were the two first countries where Putin literally sent Russian troops in to occupy portions of the country. And the part of Moldova that's known as Transnistria has had Russian troops and separate currency and passports and stuff since 2008, I think, a long time. And the main power plant for the whole country is in Transnistria. And it is a country that was really built on gas because it was, right, the modern infrastructure was built during the Soviet era. And so Putin showed once again early this year his intention to continue using energy as a weapon. And in order to try and squeeze the Moldovan government, a president then relatively newly elected and a parliamentary majority pro-EU, he's trying really hard to push them out of being inclined to join the EU, even more so with Romania. Romania, a member of NATO, a critical partner in Ukraine's fight against Russian aggression, and critical in terms of its energy stability and its grid connections into both Moldova and Ukraine. Romania has long had nuclear power and is very interested in modernizing and upgrading their nuclear power and partnering with the United States on it. And one of the biggest USAID projects in the region was a power interconnect between Romania and Moldova to allow Moldova to choose its own future by allowing Moldova to have freedom from exclusive reliance on Russian gas. So why does it matter? If you want countries that can choose through free and fair elections whether they're going to go back into the orbit of Russia or they're going to continue moving towards the EU and being democracies and supporting Ukraine in their fight for freedom, there has to be energy reliability and energy independence. The previous trip I took to Slovakia and Poland, also in the shadow of significant Russian interference in elections and elections that have gone back and forth by very small margins between more conservative nationalist pro-Russian governments, such as Prime Minister Fico now in Slovakia, and more NATO-oriented anti-Russian governments. Poland also and Slovakia have existing nuclear reactors, want to build new, want to finance, license the construction of U.S. technology. And we should partner with them with open arms.
Yeah, thank you for that. Of course, we're just on the eve of the next NATO summit, which will be in The Hague, of course, next week. And so as Europe continues to reduce its dependence on Russian gas, curious for, we have, I think, the news that'll be coming forward. We'll see if we get to a 5% consensus from NATO countries. 1.5% of that set aside for defense-related infrastructure. That could be energy. What does that look like, and where are the opportunities, do you think, for the U.S.?
When Russia brutally invaded Ukraine the second time, not 2014, 2022, Russia's ability to squeeze not just Ukraine, but much of Western Europe through Nord Stream and through their gas supplies was a critical vulnerability for the West. And several of our key NATO partners and allies in the effort to support Ukraine have made dramatic changes in their energy mix. Albeit the NATO summit, I think this is an important moment for us to double down with our partners who've kept the lights on and kept their economies growing by switching from Russian gas to American LNG. We produce the lowest carbon footprint LNG in the world, and we can continue to develop our energy sector, our energy independence, and our energy interconnectedness with our partners and allies through a real partnership with NATO that looks at stability and security for energy and for manufacturing for the long run.
Senator, that's all the time we have.
Indeed.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jenna. Thank you all very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, our next panel will start briefly. Please take your seats. Please take your seats, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Please welcome members of the Fireside Chat from Vision to Gigawatts, Accelerating Scalable Energy Solutions Worldwide, moderated by Chief Strategy Officer, Galvanized Climate Solutions, David Livingston.
All right, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this session. I am very excited to be able to participate now that I have transitioned from a previous role in the US government into an investment role at Galvanize, to be able to be speaking with two individuals who are very well suited to take us from the macro view and the generalisms and the sort of broad, and take us down to the actual business of deploying energy, meeting rising demand globally, and doing so in markets that are both easy and a little bit more complex. So without further ado, let me introduce to you our two guests today. Dimitrios Papathanasiou is Managing Director for Energy and Extractives at the World Bank here in Washington, D.C. And Mohammed Jamil Al-Ramahi is the CEO of Masdar, the UAE's global clean energy champion. I'd like to jump right into the discussion. And again, let's get the macro out of the way because it is important, but we also want this to be a panel of substance, a panel of reality, a panel of what's actually going on in the market today. But the macro makes for a very interesting market. We have obviously a deep degree of uncertainty globally in terms of geopolitics, in terms of trade, tariffs, and the macro economy. We have developed economies with limited fiscal space, policy changes taking place in the United States and elsewhere. a likely retreat from fiscal spend on clean energy transition in the United States, or at least a realignment of that fiscal, an increased fiscal coming out of Europe in the form of Germany's reindustrialization spend, the reform of the German debt brake, and all of that taking place against the backdrop of a sector that is still adjusting to higher interest rates and digesting some of the changes that has brought for the structure of the clean energy sector globally. So we have no shortage of very interesting dynamics, and that alone is challenging enough when talking about a market like the United States, but we're also here today to talk about what some would call developing economies, emerging markets, or what I personally prefer to call growth markets. So many of these markets, from India to Indonesia to Brazil to Uzbekistan, have arrived, they have emerged, and they represent some of the fastest sources of energy growth and economic growth that we see globally today. So Dimitrios, let me start with you. How has the bank's approach to these growth markets evolved? How are you meeting the demand for more electrons that we see out to 2030 and beyond? The shortfall that we have in many economies today of just basic electrons and joules in the economy. How are you meeting those, and how has your approach evolved to ensure that you're meeting that in a sustainable way as we undergo an energy transition and an energy expansion at the same time?
Thank you very much, David. It's very good to be here with everyone. And thanks to the Atlantic Council for inviting the World Bank in the Global Energy Forum. So just to put things into perspective and to context, we made an assessment of what is the level of investment that is taking place in the electricity sector in developing countries. And our assessment is that last year we had about $280 billion of investment happening. Now, at the same time, as you correctly said, the countries where we work is where you would see some of the fastest economic growth. And of course, the correlation between economic growth and demand for electricity is very, very strong. So projecting what is the world going to look like in terms of investment needs over the next decade, we're at about 280 billion today, and our estimate is that in about a decade, by 2035, the investment needs are going to be roughly 630 billion year after year after year. So this is certainly a huge market. And of course, it is a challenge. How do we mobilize the capital for these types of investments? And it's also a fantastic opportunity going forward. So this is the context. And indeed, while demand for power in Europe and in the United States has been relatively flat for a number of years, it is only now that we also see demand for electricity emerging in those markets here as well. And everything is driven to a great extent by digital services, artificial intelligence, and the fact that transportation is becoming increasingly electric. On top of everything, what we see in many of the developing countries where we are active is that demand for cooling, air conditioners, refrigerator, that is another massive lever of additional growth in electricity. So there's a lot to be done. And because of this demand coming all together everywhere, we are seeing that increasingly there are shortages that are emerging on equipment. There is a huge shortage today on combined cycle gas turbines. You have to wait for years to get a gas turbine. And frankly, the only solution that we see in the very short term tends to be clean energy investments. So wind, solar, and increasingly the combination with batteries. And this is definitely the fastest growth that we see globally, including in emerging markets.
Terrific, thank you. Now let's turn to this from a corporate perspective. Mohammed, you're the result of 2 decades nearly of visionary growth at Masdar. Many people think of Masdar or hear Masdar and they just think of a sustainable city in the desert, right? A vision of what could be. But over those 2 decades, you've really grown from a vision and an idea and a brand into an impressive balance sheet, a source of operational excellence, and a global portfolio of gigawatts and gigawatts of clean energy. Walk us through what that evolution has been like and where we arrive today in the year 2025 in terms of what your strategy is in the global energy transition.
Thanks, Dave. It's good to be here. I'm excited to be in DC. I'm also excited to have our new office here in Washington, DC, led by Mr. Philip Haddad and the team. So it's good to be here in DC. The company was established in 2006. So we've been in the business, like you've said, for 2 decades. So we have seen few cycles. And through these 20 years, almost 20 years of doing only clean energy business, we've learned a lot and we've evolved as an institution and as a company. But just to put things into perspective without you really dwelling down into the details, we've started with a 10 megawatt at Masdar City. And that 10 megawatt, which was inaugurated in 2008, was the largest solar farm, not only in the United Arab Emirates, it was the largest solar farm in the whole Arab world and the Middle East. 10 megawatt. And by the way, that 10 megawatt, 5 megawatt came from Ohio, from First Solar, and the other 5 megawatt came from South Korea. If you push the bottom and come to today, since 2008, we are closed last year with a capacity of around 50 gigawatts globally. So from 10 megawatt to 50 gigawatt, combination of wind, solar, and energy storage system, geothermal project, waste to energy projects. And in Abu Dhabi, we started with that 10 megawatt. Today we are building a 5 gigawatt project, which is the largest integrated solar plus energy storage project in the world to produce base load profile green electrons to energize and power the revolution of AI and data centers in Abu Dhabi. So almost 20 years ago, 10 megawatt to a 50 gigawatt business. We've developed projects in more than 40 countries. Today we are active in 23 countries. So in a nutshell, in terms of reach, we are the largest renewable energy company in the world. In terms of where we are operating and where we are developing. In terms of capacity, we are one of the biggest renewable energy companies in the world. And we are pure play renewable energy company. The only thing that we do is renewable energy, which makes us a very unique institution. And we work closely, of course, with the World Bank Group, particularly in the emerging and the developing world, and specifically with the IFC. The IFC has financed and funded tens of our projects in Central Asia, like Uzbekistan, or in Africa, like in Egypt and in Senegal. But like you said, the journey that we have taken is not easy. And the world that we live in is not easy. And it's getting complicated. When we started the business, renewable energy was not a sexy business. Everybody thought that we were crazy, honestly, particularly the people who are closer to us. Why would a nation that is rich, God blessed it with wealth of fossil, go and invest in renewable energy? Why do you need to do that? Well, we don't have to do that. But like you said, we had a leader that is visionary leader. Leadership that is a visionary leadership. Shareholders that see the future. So we were the first to invest in renewable energy. like we were the first to invest in AI and AI solutions. Why? Because you need to have a long view of the future. And we will go through cyclicalities as we are going through cyclicalities today. And it's going to hurt. It's going to be difficult. But we are in it for the long term. We are committed to our journey. And as you know, Dave, the past couple of years, we tripled our capacity. When we signed, you were involved in the negotiation at COP28 in Dubai. What did we say? We said we are going to triple renewable energy. And we have signed off. And guess what? We have tripled renewable energy. And we will continue our work to achieve our 100 gigawatt.
That's terrific. To get there, you need more markets, right? More markets to invest in. And to invest in some of these markets, especially emerging or frontier markets, places like India. You mentioned Uzbekistan, right? At the very beginning, you need an actual market to invest in. In other words, you need some market architecture. You need some market structure. You need some basics. It's here where I assume the World Bank plays such an instrumental role. And Dimitrios, you yourself have been investing in places like Uzbekistan, India, elsewhere for quite a while. First in just pure play renewables, then adding storage, and now looking at things like also integrating in hydrogen strategies and the like. What have you learned from those experiences about how to act as an investor that is also an architect of an emerging renewable market in some of those geographies?
Exactly. That's a really good question, right? Because we talked about how massive the needs are, and the question is, how do you mobilize the capital? How do you get investors in? So we try to figure out what is the recipe, what is the playbook on getting investments going in a country. And we came up with an approach which we presented 2.5 years ago. We call this approach scaling up to phase down. And this coincided with the COP events because we felt that especially in the countries where we work, where demand is growing so fast, we still have in the world almost 700 million people with zero access to electricity. So there's demands are absolutely there. We need electricity yesterday, not tomorrow. And we said, okay, so what does it take so that a country can get going? So we came up with a recipe which is essentially what we call the virtues cycle. And essentially the way it starts, and it is similar like Mohammed was mentioning, that you start with a strategic vision from the government, that they set some targets, ambitious or not. Then you try to put in place the regulations and the laws that will provide enough confidence to investors that at least on paper, the setup and the framework is correct. Then, which is the hardest bit, is you have to create and reinforce institutions. And these institutions can be from the agencies that do public-private partnership competition, the utilities themselves. And where we work, many of the utilities are struggling to perform financially, and this obviously discourages investors. So we have to reinforce institutional capacity in the government with the utilities, which will then yield a series of what we call bankable projects. Then you have to auction them ideally and have a transparent competitive process. We can come in and in an environment where there are uncertainties, where the risks and the risk perceptions in particular countries and particular projects are higher, we can provide some of the World Bank Group's de-risking instruments, our set of guarantees, sometimes equity capital. And if needed, we have invested in the infrastructure, maybe a transmission line for evacuation, the common infrastructure for projects. And then what we have seen, and this recipe has been demonstrated again and again and again. The project in Uzbekistan is one of them. The project in India, the whole solar, mega solar parks that we did in India is like that. We now see it increasingly all over Africa. So what happens is that when governments run a process and they procure a project, usually it is solar or solar plus batteries increasingly, the most affordable and the fastest to deploy electricity supply, which is what they need. So when we go through that phase, then what happens almost immediately is that government raises further their ambitions to do even more on clean energy. So this is the kind of virtuous cycle that we describe in scaling up to phase down. And again, this is not a theory. This is the practice that we have seen in many of the countries where we worked. And frankly, this is not just emerging economies. This is actually very similar to what the United Kingdom has done in developing their own offshore wind. If you look at the steps and how it worked, it was exactly the same, right? Prepare well bankable projects, identify the location, make sure you guarantee the rights, you have a plan for evacuation, then you call for an auction, and investors come. And the best investor comes, and the best sponsors come in. So this is the way that we're thinking about it. As I said, there are weaknesses, especially in the countries where we work on the institutional side. Who do you negotiate with? How do you make sure that utilities will be over time financially credit-worthy so that people can come and invest, and so that you can also attract lower cost capital, which, as you know, for the clean energy business is crucial. This is what helps with bringing costs down. So this is what we've been doing, and we need to do even more of that, but we know at least what needs to be done and how to do it.
But you've got a flywheel, and that's exciting, and you're turning it. Now let's do our own turn back to here at home, the United States. Mohammed, you've been a part of the UAE story of, I would say, over the past 3 years, exponential growth in the not only political, strategic, but economic relationship and deepening between the United States and the UAE. You're no small part of that. What do you see that excites you in this current environment in the US market? Tell us a little bit more about your US business and what's the outlook over the years ahead?
Definitely. But can I comment on
Please.
Because it's important. You mentioned it's not theory, and I can tell you what he said is absolutely correct. Because we've tapped into all what the World Bank has done in terms of a system and a procedure among all of these countries. Uzbekistan is one of them, Azerbaijan is the other, Iraq, in fact. You know, some of these countries had no system to allow independent power producers to come in. They are all owned by the national state. It's owned by the country, the power generator, the grid operator, the distribution companies. And they had no conceptual idea of the ability to attract investors and the ability to make these agreements bankable. So I commend you, and I commend the great work the World Bank is doing, and some of the subsidiaries of the World Bank like the IFC. And we thank you for your business and for your contribution to our success, honestly, and to the success of these countries. So if we go back to, we are in the US, we don't have to go back to the US. So,
We just have to put 2 feet firmly on the ground.
Yeah. So we've been in the US for now almost 8 years. We invested around $3 billion US. We have around 5.5 gigawatt of operational capacity across different states, mainly in California and in Texas. And we have a pipeline of around 20 gigawatts of projects. Around 10 gigawatt of that pipeline is advanced pipeline. As we speak, on average, we construct around 1 gigawatt annually in this country. And our commitment is to advance that pipeline to around 20 gigawatt by 2035. So we are still eager in deploying more capital in the United States. The US is the largest market. I mean, obviously, if you ignore China, of course, and we don't invest in China, just to put things into perspective. But it is the largest market in the world. We love the United States. It's turbulent right now as we speak. You have tariff that has been imposed, which is sudden, honestly, which is disruptive to a certain extent because it does not give the investor nor it gives the technology provider an aspect about the future. And when you are not aware about how the future would look like, you kind of take a pause on your investment horizon or your potential expansion horizon. So that's number one. And number two is the potential regulatory changes that is happening in the United States that could potentially impact renewable energy projects. Now, we don't know what the outcome of that policy change, but potentially the outcome could be negative for the future projects. It won't impact the current operational assets, but potentially it could slow down the pipeline projects. And that is something that we need to study carefully. However, we believe that regardless of the regulatory change, the market will adjust itself. And why do we know that the market will adjust itself? Because like you said, sir, growth hasn't been the way we like it, especially in the US and in the developed world. A new evolution is coming. A new revolution is coming that is called the AI revolution. So yesterday, Dr. Sultan and Secretary invited us to the INACT Majlis, and the key discussion was around energy AI nexus. And we know for a fact that the AI evolution will trigger further capacity and demand of power. And we know for a fact that even though the regulation will change, the market will demand power. And as long as the market will demand power, people like us will become creative in the way we develop our projects. And more importantly, the banks and the lenders, which is a key component in financing these projects, will also become adaptive to these changes, which will allow further growth in our sector. So while there is potential disruption as it looks from the outside, if you look deep, we think that the market will adjust itself and the business will grow.
It's terrific. I want to keep us on time to respect the audience, so I'm going to do a lightning round here, and we're going to end on the topic of innovation, technological innovation, business model innovation, policy innovation. To each of you, a 30-second answer, please, for this lightning round. What is the innovation across those three that is most focusing your energy right now? What most excites you? What innovation is coming to the market, either in the hardware or the software of the business we're talking about, that most excites you? Dimitrios, let's start with you.
So look, the constraint always has been what happens when the sun is not shining, the wind is not blowing, right? So for sure, the huge enabling factor for a massive scale-up of wind, solar is storage. Mm-hmm. And from our perspective, we will continue to support wherever the opportunity is there for hydropower and pumped storage, because it makes a lot of sense, so we do that. But what we definitely see is a lot of progress and very rapid progress happening on batteries. Different technologies and the integration of batteries within systems is becoming very fast. So this is definitely the space we're looking at, and it's the space that I think still holds the potential to radically change and radically assist in a scale-up of everything.
Terrific. Thank you very much. And Mohammed, what most excites you?
So I'm going to follow up.
I love it.
You know, it's round-the-clock power, round-the-clock green power. It's something that theoretical, it's something that we do. We are building it right now, and we are building it at scale. Coupled with AI, so you have an AI that operates the round-the-clock power solution that provides green 24/7 to our customer at scale. And financing is key. Financing is key.
Yeah. Business models to get this energy, this renewable plus storage built. Absolutely. Well, look, I heard a few key messages here today, just to round out today's session. Number one, signal versus noise. Regardless of what happens in the policy of a particular geography or whatever, we're living in a new world of load growth. We're living in a new world of demand growth. If the next 4 to 5 years are the ones that will be determinative in terms of who holds the commanding heights of the AI economy, then that means the next 4 to 5 years are determinative in terms of who can deploy the energy to power that AI economy in the fastest and cheapest way. And regardless of where preference in policy goes for clean or not, we know that if you want to go cheap and if you want to go fast, you're looking at several of the solutions that were discussed here today. Number two, we know that even as the world demands an abundance of electrons and more electrons, even those electrons in the world today are here, but they're not equally distributed, neither temporally nor geographically. The value of arbitrage over time, when overnight, as the peaks develop in the famous load curves and duck curve of geographies like California or Spain or the Gulf, as well as geographically. If we want to move those electrons across borders, across states, into where we're producing them cheapest and into where the demand is peaking, we're going to need to invest more in the grid. We're going to need to invest more in next generation technologies to achieve that, not just clean baseload, but that clean baseload at scale that Mohammed talked about. And if we do that successfully, we will move from that 10, 20, 30 megawatt pilot project that you were engaged in at the very beginning of your tenure at Masdar to not only the world we are today, where you heard Mohammed say Masdar is deploying a gigawatt, a nuclear plant's worth of renewable capacity in just the United States every year, to a world where we are talking about tens of gigawatts, and you are on your path to hitting your 100 gigawatt goal by the end of this decade. Thank you very much. Thanks for everything each of you are doing every day to drive this forward as leaders in finance and business and in development. And for the audience, please stick with us for the next session following shortly after this. Thank you.
Please welcome the Fireside Chat, Fueling the Next Era of European Energy, Diversification, moderated by President and Chief Executive Officer of the Atlantic Council, Frederick Kemp.
Hi. Far apart.
To our live audience here in DC, our online viewers, thank you for joining us here at the 9th Atlantic Council Global Energy Forum. For you who are joining us virtually, you don't know what you're missing. There's action in the corridors. There's a lot of people huddling in the rooms. You really feel a historic moment here with the nexus of energy, of geopolitics, of artificial intelligence, and we've got just the right person to talk to us about it today. I'm Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, and I'm delighted to be joined by someone I've known for some time, Foreign Minister of Norway, Espen Barth Eide. Espen, other people in this room haven't heard me say this, so I'm going to repeat what I've told you. I've long considered you one of the most strategic thinkers I know, one of Europe's leading strategic thinkers. And what a time to be challenged as a strategic thinker. So maybe we start there. It's an energy forum. you're a foreign minister. You've been defense minister, you haven't been energy minister. But, you know, as you look to the situation in Ukraine, as you look to the situation in Iran, and as you think about the energy elements of it, the security elements of it, and then you're wearing your hat as foreign minister, how do these tie together? And what role, maybe starting with Ukraine and what we're watching there, what role has energy played in this conflict, and what role is it playing now?
So thank you, Fred. First, let me say I'm thrilled to be here with you and with the Atlantic Council on this energy forum. I think it is deeply connected. The geopolitics of energy is important for foreign ministers and defense ministers and experts on foreign policy, because it is so central to power dynamics and what you can get done and how you can be threatened. And I think what we saw in Europe in particular was that as the Ukraine war started, at least the full-scale war, the invasion in February 22, we saw a soaring price of energy in all over Europe. We saw energy shortage. We saw kind of a panic developing over energy security. And Europe really understood, finally, and maybe way too late, that it is extremely dangerous to make yourself as dependent on a energy source like Russia was. And when Russia started to use that weapon, it was really felt in Europe. But I would also say I think Putin failed, because we were able in Europe to get our act together. Norway is now the #1 energy provider to Europe. 30% of all energy that the EU and the UK imports is from, or uses rather, is from Norway. That is oil and gas, particularly gas, of course, through 9,000 kilometers of pipelines, but also increasingly a renewable element with electricity interconnectors that connects us to Europe. And we really feel that we're in the middle of this changing geopolitics of energy in Europe. And that's just part of it, because these very days, I think a lot of people have their attention on what's happening in Iran, what's happening in the Middle East. That's not a newcomer to the geopolitics of energy, but it just reminds us that everything is connected, and particularly security policy, security, reliance on resources versus what you can do yourself, the degree to which you can create energy independence is so much related to security policy, and we're in the middle of all that. So, I mean, it's absolutely normal, I think, for a Norwegian foreign minister to care about energy.
Even more for a Norwegian foreign minister, given the fact that you are an energy power. You gave the very interesting statistic as Norway replacing Russia as Europe's largest supplier of gas following the 2022 energy crisis, Putin's invasion of...
We used to be #2 for many years after Russia, but then we were able to ramp up, and because the infrastructure was there and we had good partners on the other side, I think we were an important part of the solution. So was some of the Gulf states, and so was the US, because there was also a fast investment in LNG terminals, so one could receive more LNG from, for instance, the US. But the totality of that made sure that we did not get the scarcity, we did not get the shocking prices over time. And now actually the European Commission just today or yesterday came up with proposals for making Europe, EU-Europe, totally independent of Russian energy in a couple of years. And if that's go through the European Parliament and the European Council, that's actually a significant change, which means that what President Putin at least has achieved is to make sure Sweden and Finland join NATO, and that nobody's going to buy Russian gas any longer.
Since you went there,
within Europe, that is.
I'm going to ask a follow-up question on the U.S. in a second, but since you went there with that European decision, it was interesting how the decision was made. Less consensus of all countries, but more through law, and the landlocked countries may not be held to the same standard. Tell me about this agreement that's just been made, which I think Hungary and Slovakia might not be part of.
They are probably not so happy about it. So this is still, I mean, let's see, which is why this is a proposal from the Commission. And I expect not everybody knows how the EU works, but it has to go through Parliament and the Council where all the countries meet. But there's a lot of, the vast majority of countries wants this to happen. And we are not in the EU, but we are very close. And of course, as the #1 provider of energy to Europe, we have a keen interest in how this will end up. But I have to say, some of the states that, even the Baltic states and states who are very firm in their support of Ukraine, very critical like us on what Putin is doing, has been able to go from a very high dependency on Russian energy to practically zero dependence on Russian energy. And that is alternative gas routes, but it also Baltic grid and an increasing emphasis on interconnectors of renewable energy, which is good for security policy and for resilience, for strategic autonomy, but also good for climate transition, because sometimes these two goals coincide. You know, by investing in renewables, you are both cleaning up your energy system, but at the same time, you are also providing more energy independence from powers like Russia. But it does require an investment in transnational grids, which means that one of the security policy issues of the future is grid politics, which in a sense will replace some of the more classical oil routes.
Fascinating observation. So you talked about U.S. LNG and the role that it played with Norwegian sources. So U.S. LNG and Norwegian gas now meet over 70% of Europe's gas demand. How can the U.S. and Norway align to ensure infrastructure permitting and trade policies support this role long term? And to what extent is this already some form of alignment?
I think there is a rather deep alignment, because we have a shared interest in assisting our allies and friends in Europe in not returning to that dependency on Russia. And as you said, I mean, that will be US LNG and other sources, but particularly LNG and Norwegian pipeline gas. And some of our friends in the Gulf together can actually provide the amount of energy that Europe needs. And of course, also to be part of this transition into both increasing use of electricity, but also of molecules that are less, through CCS, for instance, carbon capture and storage, to reduce the emissions from molecules. And all that, and there are deep partnerships being built around this, and we very much welcome US interest in this theme. And I should also say that as we move into the energy of the mid-21st century, which there will be more windmills and solar photovoltaic panels and batteries, there is an increasing demand for rare earths and minerals and metals. And that's also a theme for, these are not evenly distributed. So I think if you want strategic autonomy from authoritarian states, we need to invest now in how we make sure that some of these sources are controlled by Western friends and allies.
So let's talk about prices and the geopolitics of prices. So a $75 barrel of oil or a high price for gas might actually be good for Norway, but it's also good for Vladimir Putin. And $50 might be worse for Vladimir Putin, but also maybe not as good for other producers who are not trying to undermine their neighbor and rub out their borders and take away their sovereignty and independence. How do you see the prices playing out on this? And then also sanctions, as you know, there's talk now about secondary sanctions. Have we squeezed Putin enough, both in terms of the enforcement of sanctions and then the expansion of sanctions?
Answer is no. And I would welcome stronger sanctions also from the US side. There are now a new package of European sanctions coming out. And one of the things that we work on, particularly with some of our closest neighbors, the Nordic and Baltic countries, is how we better control the shadow fleet, all these sort of flagless or convenience flagged ships that are exporting Russian oil that violates the price cap and the sanctions. So that's part of it. And it's true we sell oil, so you would think we would like high prices, but we do a lot of other things too. One of the things we do is that we have the largest sovereign wealth fund, and that's invested half of that in the US. So we're interested in the US economy doing well. So, and we also understand that high prices has another effect. So high prices works both ways for us. So whereas for Putin, he always would like high prices because he spends everything he gets. We put most of this into a fund, which is then being invested in everything else than oil and gas. And that's why we would rather say that we would have sort of stable, predictable prices, not necessarily the highest possible prices.
So much going on in the world. We've talked about Iran, and Iran's in a very crucial state right now. With Israel having taken the action it's taken, the air defenses are down. President Trump today has talked about an unconditional surrender of Iran. Stretch what you're talking about regarding Ukraine to the Iranian situation. Where do you see that we are right now in this situation? It really does seem to have hit a true inflection point. And what role does energy play in this?
Well, that's actually at least two questions in one.
There's probably five.
On the sort of the hottest topic of, literally speaking, the day, and I mean not metaphorically, literally the day, is that everything can happen in the coming hours.
Right.
We could either have a massive expansion of this de facto war with more involvement from other countries, or we can see that we are back on track with a nuclear agreement, a deal with Iran. It's not impossible. The likelihood is not increasing, but it's not impossible. And inside the set of tweets that we get from President Trump, there is also a rather consistent message that a deal would be good, but a lot of pressure on Iran making that a deal where there is absolutely no room for enrichment, definitely not to weapons grade and maybe not at all, and that you need not only a deal but also very effective controls and inspections on that, as was originally existed with the Obama deal, which then was left behind by Trump, and which he now wants back, something of that sort. So it can go both ways. Obviously, if we go to a major war, even bigger than today, it will affect not only Iranian exports, but also everything happening in the Hormuz Straits and so on. I think that will probably have a rather significant impact on prices. And then the question is, what does OPEC do with that? Will they be able to stabilize prices by increasing production, for instance? On Ukraine, it has, as a European and as a transatlanticist, I still believe it is the most daunting challenge, is to make sure that Ukraine emerges from what's happening now as a free, independent, sovereign nation that can make its own choices. And that is also about energy independence. And here, as a major energy power, we have spent much of our civilian support on purchasing gas, replacing energy facility stuff that has been destroyed, but also assisting Ukraine in making a more resilient distributed energy system through the war and for the post-war situation. So again, Ukraine needs missiles and drones and weapons technology, but they also need to keep the economy alive, and that can only be done with reasonable access to energy. So that's part of it again.
So let's come back, because Iran, as you said, is an hourly issue and not. Let's stick with that for just a moment. My own impression is that this really is the week or two where incredibly important things will be decided about Iran and concerning Iran. That this situation that's gone on for years and years has kind of hit a point of decision making where it's Iran doing a deal that gets it out of anything like the nuclear weapons business, or facing more military attacks. But one way or another, things could be decided relatively soon. Is that your impression? Do you get the feeling that we're in that kind of moment of the?
So, Fred, I think one should generally have lived long enough to know that you should be careful about saying that this is a historic moment when you're in it, because you actually know later. But this time, I think it's a strong candidate. I think we are now in a week, days where which, as you said, very much an inflection point. It can really go both ways. It's still possible. We do speak to all players here. I actually met both the Iranian foreign minister and the Omani foreign minister last week, just before all this happened. We're also in contacts with the US administration. As of last Wednesday, there were real expectations that there would be a meeting in Muscat in Oman on Sunday, 2 days ago, for the 6th round of talks. And everybody sounded like this was difficult. By all means, everybody recognized, particularly the issue of enrichment, but not impossible. Then comes the Israeli attack and the response from Iran. And the question is it possible to get back there? Can even what's happening now actually accelerate the pace towards an agreement, which I would not preclude? Or will it make it all very impossible? And so I think we are now at a very, very, very critical moment for the world, for the Middle East, and also for energy.
Thank you for that. So you visited already with Secretary of State Rubio this week?
I'm seeing him tomorrow.
You're seeing him tomorrow. So Norway has always played an outsized role of importance in this city. You've had remarkable ambassadors, including your latest, who had your job at a different point, the foreign minister, and so it's great to have you here, Ambassador. As you go into a meeting with the Secretary of State, talk to me about what's the nature of the relationship right now? What are your highest priorities? You probably don't have nearly enough time to discuss everything you need to discuss. So what do you see as the most important things to put on the table?
Since you mentioned our ambassador, Anniken Huitfeldt, who's sitting right here, there's no coincidence that you have a former foreign minister of Norway as the ambassador. It's precisely because of the very high importance that we put on this relationship, and that we need that kind of political top-level experience to navigate this town in the best possible way. So very happy with that. And I would say our partnership with the US is very strong. It has in no way got any less strong with this administration. I'm absolutely open in that there are decisions being made here on global issues that I do not always agree with. I don't think I'm alone in that, but our partnership is strong and growing. We have a very close defense and intelligence cooperation over the Arctic, particularly Russia's north, the Kola Peninsula, which is the highest concentration of nuclear weapons anywhere on the planet, and which is just outside our door. And we cooperate well on a lot of other issues. And I think with many US administrations, we have realized that the fact that we speak to everybody is actually quite interesting in Washington. Sometimes it's in the open, sometimes it's not in the open, but we share insights with our friends here, and that's generally rather welcome.
So you and I will both be in The Hague next week, you as foreign minister, I with the Atlantic Council delegation, and doing convening around the Hague summit. What's your hope for that summit? What's a success, and what is a lack of success?
We're Atlantic Council, and I'm a transatlanticist, and I very much care about NATO, not only the organization, but the purpose of NATO, which is to keep together the two sides of the Atlantic closely together politically. And I always appreciate when the Atlantic Ocean is narrow in political sense. And if we move away from each other, we have to try to get back to where we were or go forward rather together. I think it's going to be a good summit. I have to say, frankly, that when we were, all of us, Anniken also, was in Munich in February, we were a little bit worried about some of the signals that came from the American representatives there. We were not so certain about the degree of commitment to the transatlantic alliance then, but much of what has happened later suggests that we are finding an agreement which is more or less around the theme that, yes, Europe needs to do more. It's absolutely a natural ask from the US, and it's not new with Trump that Europe should pay more for its own defense and invest more in its own defense, but that we need to keep that strategic partnership with the US. Also, because if the US wants to spend more of its mental bandwidth on Asia, on rise of China, for instance, it's exactly a good argument to keep your friends in good shape and to maintain that important partnership that will free up energy and bandwidth to work on Asian issues. And I think we've also seen how much these are connected. Remember that in the war in Ukraine, you have North Korean troops fighting with Russia. You have Iranian Shahed drones bombing Ukrainian cities. We have the question mark around the degree of involvement of China over there. So any idea that you can separate between a European theater, a Middle Eastern theater, and an Asian theater that are totally separate is simply wrong. I think over time that understanding has, should I say, improved also here.
But on the agenda will be the 3.5%, 5% spending. We visited with Secretary General Mark Rutte a couple of weeks ago, and he seems confident that he can get there. The 3.5% on pure defense spending, I don't know over what period of time, 1.5% of defense related spending. There's also production agreements of one sort or another. So is that what will be success? And what seems not to be on the agenda, interestingly enough, is Ukraine in the way that I would hope it would be at the moment. So where do you think one is on the spending issue? And then where do you think one is on the Ukraine issue? And how is Europe feeling? How is Norway feeling about where the administration is right now in relation to Ukraine, the peace talks they're trying to bring forward, et cetera?
For NATO, next week in The Hague, I will not guarantee, but I think we're moving towards consensus on this 5%, understood as 3.5% classical defense spending, which is, by the way, roughly where the US is now for NATO standards, because technically, because all other allies are welfare states, it means that health and stuff are outside, and in the US it's in the budget. So if you correct for that, that's more or less where you are. But the better argument is that this is more or less where if you look at the defense capability ambitions that NATO has set, that takes you more or less to 3.5%. And then the 1.5%, which will add to 5% together, is, as you said, for defense relevant investments in infrastructure, ports, airports, and so on, which are not necessarily military material or salaries. There are a few countries who have not signed up yet, but the majority of NATO is moving there, and I think with the good spirit of the meeting, it will happen. On Ukraine, I think, again, there is a broad understanding in Europe that we not only should do more, but we actually do much more. It's been, over the last months, I've seen a significant increase in support for Ukraine, military and civilian from European countries. But it's paramount that the US is still in, even if there's sort of a burden shifting in volume. I think to have that connection is important for Ukraine to prevail. And in Washington, I'm very eager to say that Ukraine is not just Ukraine. The outcome of Ukraine, whether it's good, bad, or terrible, or somewhere in the middle, will not only define the future of Ukraine and Russia, but also the rest of Europe. And in quotation mark, a cheap peace can become a cheap end of the war. A cheap ceasefire can quickly turn into a very expensive peace because you leave some questions unanswered. So, we have the experience from Korea in July '53. The war ended, but it's basically a cessation of hostilities that never turned into a peace agreement. And ask anybody in Asia if North Korea is a problem. I think most people, apart from North Koreans, will think they are. And I think we need to get something that is more settled when Ukraine is done.
And just briefly, what would you like from the United States on Ukraine?
A solid commitment to, I think it's excellent that the president would like to end this war. I mean, by all means, I think nobody would like to end this war more than the Ukrainians themselves. But it has to be a just peace, and it has to be a lasting peace. These are basically the two asks. That means Ukraine cannot be pushed to recognize de jure, as they say, loss of territory. They might be able to, I mean, their words, they might understand that they might have to live with the loss of effective control of some parts of the country, but they cannot accept that as a legal change, and they have to retain real sovereignty. And if a ceasefire and then later a peace accord reflects that, I think it's possible to end the war. So we welcome the desire to end the war, but it's important that we look into the quality of that ceasefire and that war, and I don't think it can be done without some US involvement, even if we Europeans are ready to do more. And my corner of Europe, the Nordic-Baltic group, is very much in the center of this and driving much of the thinking, frankly.
So we're in the last couple of minutes, so final question, let's come back to energy. And here, let me start with the bilateral partnership and broader transatlantic cooperation on energy. As you look to expand oil drilling, is there a role for the U.S. to support this effort or anything else on the energy front? Clearly, everyone here at this conference is talking about the surge of demand that's going to come from data centers and AI. Do you share that? And I know this is the last question, it's only a couple of minutes, but are there specific U.S.-Norway joint initiatives in energy that we should know about? CCS, hydrogen, offshore wind, and so in clean energy investment?
There's a major, our largest energy company, Equinor, has a major wind farm being built outside of New York State. There were some question marks around it, but now it's back on track. There is a lot, I mean, since the very beginning of the oil age, there were a lot of Texans helping us to get this knowledge, and that these are close partnerships already, which are long-standing. Yes, on CCS, we are very much eager to see more cooperation on the practical use of carbon capture and storage. And also, as I said, as we move to the next, deeper into this century, critical raw materials, we are, we have an initial agreement from the final months of the last administration, where Secretary Blinken and I signed a memorandum of not understanding, but intent, which is just before you have understanding. Of strengthening cooperation on this access to these raw materials that are critical as we transition. And we don't really need help. I mean, we have a vast ocean space. All our oil and gas is offshore. And thanks to the UNCLOS, UN Law of the Seas Convention, which is very good for countries with the coast, by the way. I strongly recommend the Congress to ratify. It's good for you. It's been extremely healthy for us because we have a lot of untapped resources. But because we understand where we're heading, we're trying to focus our further drilling on fields that are adjacent to existing infrastructure for the moment, So to try to keep up the pressure, keep up the ability to deliver to Europe, but also recognizing that the long-term trajectory is that the world will move into new forms of energy, but that's definitely way into the future. And then on data centers and so on, here AI and data centers makes me a little bit, it's fascinating technology that can be used for a lot of good stuff, but it's the only thing where you use more and more energy. Everything else, we get better, houses are getting warm or cold with less energy than 20 years ago. Cars go faster, go further, whether electric or petrol cars go further with the same amount of energy. And everything is getting more energy efficient, apart from AI and so on, which the data centers are now gobbling up much of the energy that's around. So we need to think about that, and it's I heard that there were several conversations on that. It's really connected to the whole geopolitics of energy.
Yeah, and in fact, the conversations about how AI can help us solve that through advanced batteries.
To use more energy to later use less energy.
Absolutely. So, Norwegian Foreign Minister Espen Barth Eide, as always, what a rich conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad.
Ladies and gentlemen, please keep your seats. Please welcome the Leadership Spotlight, moderated by the 15th Secretary of Energy of the United States, the Honorable Dan Brouillette.
Hello and welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here today. Thank you to our partners in the UAE, Dr. Sultan Al Jaber and the Atlantic Council, for putting on a fantastic energy forum. It's an honor to be with you. And it's an honor today to have an important energy player who happens to be from my home state of Louisiana. Very proud of that. And he has obviously been a leader on energy policy here in Washington, D.C., but also in our home state. And he's been a champion of all forms of energy, which I really appreciate. I think we all know that he is a medical doctor, but there's a couple things that you may not know about Dr. Senator Cassidy. Back when he graduated LSU Medical School, he worked at Earl K. Long Hospital, which we used to call Charity Hospital a long time ago, providing free health care to Louisiana's uninsured. After the hurricane that hit Louisiana, Katrina, Dr. Cassidy opened up in a borrowed, converted Kmart store a basic healthcare facility to take care of those people right after the hurricane. And he is the first physician to lead the Senate's Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee since 1933, when I think Huey Long was the senator from Louisiana. So it's been quite a while. Senator, welcome, and thank you for taking time today.
Thank you, Dan.
So we're going to talk about energy here for the next couple of minutes. And Senator, I wanted to point something out that you said quite a bit of time ago, actually before Ukraine, before Russia invaded Ukraine, before the Iranian situation that we're all following closely today. You said that there are new energy and geopolitical realities that the world needs to recognize. I wonder if you can just tell us, what did you mean by that? Are supply chains changing? Is the energy policy world changing? Is the energy industry itself changing? And if so, what do you think policymakers, what do you think the energy industry should do in response to these new geopolitical realities?
I'll start off at 60,000 feet because each of you knows of what I'm going to say. Clearly, at the point that I said that before the Ukraine war, the Russians were supplying natural gas to Western Europe, et cetera. But what I may have been referring to in particular is that China, in its effort to undermine, to gain economic advantage relative to the United States, does not enforce rules governing pollution that are acceptable to the international community. That lowers their cost of manufacturing by about 20%, incentivizing manufacturing to move to China, making their economy stronger. We know what China has done with their stronger economy. They've militarized and used their wealth through Belt and Road string of pearls to, if you will, establish a Chinese hegemony through debt diplomacy and other things. And if you will, energy policy. They're going to use coal and not enforce environmental regulations. The EU is going to put in a cap and trade. The US is going to use regulations. We lower our emissions, but theirs grows more than our decrease put together, has led to the rise of China and to the rise of their militarization and to the problems we now see in terms of a competing global superpower.
So we have different regulatory regimes around the world. Some of them you might characterize as perhaps unfair. That also applies to trade policy, I would suggest as well, and I think you have suggested that publicly as well. How do you respond to what many in the industry, perhaps many policymakers, refer to as unfair trade practices? Are tariffs a tool, or are there other tools that we might consider?
Well, again, speaking specifically about how China will ignore international standards for pollution control. And by the way, there's once a guy I talked to, CFO, and he said the company he formerly was with, if they built in China, they'd have an 18% ROI because they had been told you don't have to turn on your scrubbers. And if they built in the US, because they did, their ROI would be 9%. He goes, I can't defend on an investor call here, not there. So he goes there, so does economic growth. So how do you address that? I have proposed what we call a foreign pollution fee. It's a version of a carbon border adjustment mechanism. It looks at the carbon intensity of certain products being produced in China, compares them to the carbon intensity of a good produced here. Notice, we don't prescribe how you get to that lower carbon intensity. The Europeans always want you to have a cap and trade. We've got a regulatory regime, which an economist would tell me is approximate. There is a cost associated with the compliance with that regulatory regime, which effectively amounts to a tax. You add that plus our natural gas bonanza, and we've been able to lower our emissions more than the Europeans. So going back to the Chinese, we propose a foreign pollution fee for any country importing here that would be roughly commensurate with the avoided cost of not controlling that air pollutant relative to the United States. And in that, we think that we level that playing field. We're more likely to bring that industry back. We're more likely to create jobs here and put a drag on their economy as they attempt to avoid the fee. And as you drag their economy, they have less money to militarize. If you will, a nexus of several things that are of importance to us, but all of them resolving positively.
So I've heard you say the phrase, and I've heard others say it as well, energy security is national security. You just referred to our natural gas bonanza. Our home state produces a lot of natural gas, and we export a lot of natural gas from LNG facilities all along the Gulf Coast. Talk to me about why that matters in terms of national security, and does it matter to the U.S. economy as much as it matters to perhaps our allies in Europe or Asia or elsewhere?
So if there is a nexus between national security, economic security, energy policy, then natural gas is at the center of that. We're going to need plastics. My gosh, like everything we're looking at here today, except for each other and our wool suits, is made out of plastic. And that plastic increasingly is from natural gas, if not wholly from natural gas. So the things, the chemicals, the medicines, the goods, the materials that we need for modernity right now are being manufactured from natural gas. That's essential. The fact that we can produce it domestically means that we're not paying for oil from elsewhere to produce the same good. We're actually paying a worker a pretty good wage to develop and produce that natural gas, transport it, and then to convert it into that usable thing. That is an economic development policy for our country, which is making working families stronger. If there's a constant in my bio, it's an incredible sympathy for working families. And this is a policy for working families. But in that, as you increase our economy, you increase our ability to support whatever our government has to do, whether it's defense or whether it's domestic programs. I think it also positions us very well competitively. Since 1990, and Dan and so many people in here could correct me if I get this wrong, I'm hesitant to say, but as I recall, since 1990, our greenhouse gas emissions are lower now than they were in 1990, despite more oil and gas production, a much bigger economy, and more people, by about 30 million people. And that's because of natural gas replacing coal. A little bit of renewables is mainly natural gas. So we're creating jobs at the wellhead. We are strengthening our economy. We're lowering our emissions for those who are concerned about such. That is a trifecta. And if we continue it and get the Chinese to buy our natural gas in order to lower their emissions, cost them a little bit more, drags their economy, creates more jobs for us. So I do think national security, economic security is tied up with energy policy.
Now, tie that to some of the technologies. I agree with you completely. We've reduced our emissions here in the United States dramatically, in my lifetime, dramatically. Yet we use more energy today than we ever have. And I think that's going to continue for some time, largely due to, as you pointed out, natural gas supplanting other forms of heavier hydrocarbons, but also because of the innovation in the industry. I think they've done a great job. Things like carbon capture, methane emissions. The industry has done a phenomenal job at tackling those issues for the American people as well as the rest of the world. Some of the newer technologies coming on, I think, may accelerate some of that. Now, you and I were talking about AI before we came out here. How does that technology impact us going forward as a nation? How does it relate to energy security? How does it relate to our national security? My basic question is, can we produce enough energy to meet the demand that everyone says will be coming on in the next few years?
I think we can, but again, how we get there, I'm not quite so sure. Geothermal, using techniques developed in fracking, except instead of releasing natural gas, you release the heat, and the heat turns the turbine, which then produces the energy, which can be co-located next to the AI facility. That's one idea. The Trump administration has said that they're going to not mothball or disassemble some of the coal-fired plants. And the big tech people tell me, okay, listen, we know there's more greenhouse gas emissions associated with it. Just get us over this hump, and eventually we'll replace that with something which is a lower emission profile. The president has made a commitment to 5 nuclear plants by 2030. Not sure how we're going to get there. Maybe it's SMR, but also more fully by 2050. So I think that AI connection with energy is to be developed and being developed by a lot of people in this room.
I think it is as well. And, you know, there are newer technologies coming on with regard to electricity generation. We think about things like small modular reactors, small nuclear reactors, potentially even fusion reaction at some point in the future. So we're very excited about that. Your support for the U.S. Department of Energy is absolutely key. And I have to thank you publicly for your support of those 17 national laboratories, those scientific laboratories. They're really the crown jewels of research and development here in the United States and frankly around the world. Senator, thank you for your time. I know you have a vote coming up, so we're going to let you run. Sir, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you for joining us at the leadership stage for today's programming. We ask that you please join us now at the energy stage for closing remarks.
Variable generation, which